नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरये। नष्टप्रायेषु भद्रेषु नित्यं भागवत सेवया भगवती उत्तम श्लोके भक्ते भवति नैष्टिकी। Reading from Bhagavad Gita as it is, chapter 8, containing the supreme text 4. Adhibhutam Sharaha Bhavaha Adhibhutam Sharo Bhavaha Purushaha Cha Adhidaivatam Purushascha Adhidaivatam Adhiyajnaha Aham Eva Atra Adhiyajnoham Evatra Dehe Dehabhritam Vara Dehe Dehabhritam Vara Adhibhutam Sharo Bhavaha Purushascha Adhidaivatam Adhiyajnoham Evatra Dehe Dehabhritam Vara Adhibhutam Sharo Bhavaha Purushascha Adhidaivatam Adhiyajnoham Evatra Dehe Dehabhritam Vara Adhibhutam Sharo Bhavaha Purushascha Adhidaivatam Adhiyajnoham Evatra Dehe Dehabhritam Vara
Adhibhutam Sharo Bhavaha Purushasthadidaivatam Adhiyajnoham Evatra Dehe Dehabhritam Vara Adhibhutam Sharo Bhavaha Purushasthadidaivatam Adhiyajnoham Evatra Dehe Dehabhritam Vara
Adhibhutam Sharo Bhavaha
Adhibhutam Sharo Bhavaha
Purushasthadidaivatam
Purushasthadidaivatam
Adhiyajnoham Evatra Dehe Dehabhritam Vara
Adhibhutam Sharo Bhavaha Purushasthadidaivatam Adhiyajnoham Evatra Dehe Dehabhritam Vara
Adhibhutam Sharo Bhavaha
Purushasthadidaivatam
Adhiyajnoham Evatra
Dehi Dehavritambara.
Adibhutam Sharobhavaha Purushashradiदैवतम् Adiyajnohamevatra Dehe Dehapritamvara Adibhutam Sharobhavaha Purushashradiदैवतम् Adiyajnohamevatra Dehe Dehavritambara. What were meaning? Adibhutam, the physical manifestation. Sharaha, constantly changing. Bhavaha, nature. Purushaha, the universal form. Cha, and Adidaivatam, including all demigods, like the sun and moon. Adiyagnaha, the super soul. Aham, I, Krishna. Eva, certainly. Atra, in this. Dehe, body. Dehavritam, of the embodied. Vara, the supreme. Translation and purport by Divine Grace and Sripati Translation. Physical nature is known to be endlessly mutable. The universe is this cosmic form of the Supreme Lord, and I am that Lord represented as a super soul, dwelling in the heart of every embodied being. Translation with revelation. Physical nature is known to be endlessly mutable. The universe is the cosmic form of the Supreme Lord, and I am that Lord represented as a super soul, dwelling in the heart of every embodied being. Prabhupada. The physical nature is constantly changing. Material bodies usually pass through 6 stages. They are born, they grow, they remain for some duration, they produce some byproducts, they dwindle, and then they vanish. This physical nature is called Adibhutam. Because it is created at a certain point and will be annihilated at a certain point, the conception of the universal form of the Lord, the conception of this universal form of the Supreme Lord, that includes all the demigods and their different planets, is called Adi Daivatam. The individual soul, Jiva, accompanies the body. The super soul, the plenary representation of Lord Krishna, is called the Paramatma or Adiyajna and is situated in the heart. The word Eva is particularly important in the context of this verse because by this word, the Lord stresses that the Paramatma is not different from him. The super soul, the supreme personality of Godhead, seated beside the individual soul, is the witness of the individual soul's activities and is a source of consciousness. The super soul gives the jiva an opportunity to act freely and he witnesses his activities. The functions of all these different manifestations of the Supreme Lord automatically become clarified for the pure Krishna conscious devotee engaged in transcendental service of the Lord. The gigantic universal form of the Lord, called Adidaivatam, is contemplated by the neophyte who cannot approach the Supreme Lord in his manifestation as super soul. The neophyte is advised to contemplate the universal form whose legs are considered the lowest planets and whose eyes are considered the sun and moon and whose head is considered the upper planetary system. Thus ends the Transcendental Bhaktivedanta purport. Om Ajnanatinmirandasya Jnanachakshalakhaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Namo Vishnupādāya Krishna Preshthāya Bhūtale Śrīmate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Bhashyachyate Shrutanine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaurabhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. So, we are meeting after quite a while. We had Kartik meditations for a long time. And therefore, although chapter 8 started quite a while ago, we actually haven't moved very far in this chapter. So I thought I'll briefly just touch upon some of the verses earlier. Basically, there were 3 verses before this verse. So chapter 8 is titled is Attaining the Supreme. And this is very much continuing from the discussion that ended in the last chapter. In the last chapter, the 7th chapter towards the end, the Supreme Lord was explaining to Arjuna as how he is the governing principle of all the manifestation. And he is the underlying principle, or he is underlying all the demigods. And he one who with a steadfast mind knows only one who has got the steadfast mind attached to the Lord and remember him at the point of death. And these were some of the things that were discussed in the last verse of the last chapter, 7th chapter, the knowledge of the Absolute. And Arjuna immediately beginning the 8th chapter starts asking questions. And the first verse, Arjuna starts asking 5 questions, and then 3 more in the second verse. So in the first verse, it says, Arjuna Uvacha, Kim Tat Brahma, Kim Adhyatmam, Kim Karma Purushottamam, Adhibhutam Cha Kim Proktam, Adidaivam Kim Uchyate. So he's asking, Kim Brahma, what is Brahma? Kim Adhyatmam, what is itself? Kim Karma, what is karma? And Kim Adhibhutam, the Adhibhutam is the material manifestation. Here Prabhupada translates as the physical manifestation. And then Kim Adhidaiva, that is also discussed here today, that all the demigods like the sun and the moon. And then in the verse 2, Arjuna continues asking questions. Adhiyagna katham kok atra tehe asmin madhusudana prayana kale chakatham neyosi niyatatma bhihi. So here we can see Adibhutam and Adidaivatam, which are the questions, 4th and 5th questions in the first verse. And then in the second verse, what is Adiyagna? Who is Adiyagna? Is asked in the second verse, and that is being explained by the Lord. So, and then in the third verse, the Lord starts explaining answers to these questions and begins with explaining what is Atma, what is Brahman, and then he explains what is Karma. He also explains what is Adhyatma. So that was briefly we saw in the last week, brief description about all these things. So today's verse continues from the 4th, 5th, and 6th questions. So those are briefly described with the Lord here. And then starting the next verse, there is description about Prayana Kala. So, or Antakala, at the time of death, what is that is to be done? And what happens to a person who ends his life in a certain way, or who ends his life in a different way? What happens to them? So, the Prayana Kale, the Antakale, the end of life, what happens to one based upon the state of being in which one is existing at that point of time. will be discussed. So in today's verse, it is being discussed here that Adhibhutam Sharo Bhavaha. So Prabhupada translates Adhibhutam as the physical manifestation. So there is this material manifestation which is visible to our eyes, our senses, and to a certain degree to our mind. We speculate or to understand, or we use our minds to understand the existence of certain things, which is physically manifested into us. So there is this one form of existence that we can see, that is physical manifestation. And therefore, usually people in this world are enamored, or people are only knowledgeable about the physical manifestation, and also to a certain degree. Now, this physical manifestation, of which we are all trying to acquire different kinds of understanding. So, in all of the education, in all of that our works, we are only trying to understand what is happening in this physical manifestation. So, if you look at newspapers, you're talking about what is happening. Oh, there is a rainfall here, there is a drought here, there is a war here, there is some other thing that is happening here. So we are saying what is happening in this physical manifestation. Similarly, normal discussions on the weather is good or the weather is cold. So we are talking about physical manifestation. How is it changing? So there is a certain nature of this physical manifestation. And what is that? Sharaha. This word sharaha and aksharaha are frequently used or used in multiple places in Vedic literature. So one meaning of the word sharaha, which Prabhupada is explaining here, is constantly changing. And there's another meaning of the word sharaha, which means fallible, which is used in 15th chapter. So there is a specific nature of this physical manifestation, and that is sharaha. That means it is constantly changing. That means it is not going to exist the way it is all the time. For a moment of time, it may exist in a certain way, and then very soon it will change its existence into some other form. Prabhupada gives an example. So let us take a few examples to understand this principle of what does this constant change mean. So let us take, for example, if you look at anything here, let's take this example of this chair in which I'm sitting. Now, it has got a certain form. It has got a certain manifestation in the current state. But if I were to ask, what is this chair maybe 100 years ago? Or what this chair will be 50 years from now? It may not exist, or it will not exist in the form it is right now. So perhaps there is no tree from which the wood is taken out to make this chair. And maybe 50 years, 100 years, this wood will not exist in the form right now how it is existing. So this change of physical nature means there is a certain kind of temporariness to it. It is not having an eternal, similar form all the time. And therefore, everything in the physical manifestation is always changing. It's always in constant motion. Now, this is a very important principle because when living entity is not aware of anything beyond physical manifestation, the living entity thinks that this change is the way of life and I should be always undergoing a change. A change means sometimes happiness, sometimes distress. So in this physical manifestation, when the living entity, Sada Samudvigna Dhyam. So as Prahlad Maharaj says, Sada Samudvigna Dhyam. So Asad Grahat. So when one's intelligence is absorbed in this Asad Grahat means which is temporary or which is constantly changing. So as one's mind is attached to things which are constantly changing, then one will be always Sada Samudvigna. He will be always in anxiety. The reason why people are all in anxiety is because we are all attached to the non-permanence. We are attached to things which are physical manifestation, which do not have permanence, eternal existence. And therefore, the living entity, who is of a different nature, the the living entity, the Atma, the spirit soul, is an entity which is never changing. It is eternally existing. As we see in the Bhagavad Gita, very beginning, the Lord, in the very beginning of his instruction, begins to explain that the nature of the spirit soul is eternal. Na hanyate hanyamani sharire. There's no birth or death to the soul. There is birth and death to the body, but not to the soul. The soul is always existing. And it is only undergoing, the body is undergoing from boyhood to youth to old age. It's constantly changing, but the observer, but the knower in the body is not changing. So this distinction of understanding is very important for one to become dhiraha. So, Tenu asmin yatha dehe kaumaram yauvanam jara tatha dehantra praptir dhira satra namuyati. So one is not bewildered. Muyati means bewildered. One becomes bewildered by this manifestation. So sometimes things are going well, sometimes things are not going well, and we become very agitated. And when one is agitated, one cannot be sober. And the word dhira means sober, one who is undisturbed. Prabhupada uses and explains this word dhira in different places. And Prabhupada also says, I think it is the poet, I think it is Kalidas, who says that dhira means one who is undisturbed even when one is provoked, or unagitated even when one is provoked. So we are constantly provoked externally or sometimes circumstantially. Various situations provoke us in different ways and we become agitated. And Prabhupada gives his own example of what it means to be dhira. Prabhupada says one of the reasons why we become agitated is because of ignorance. And Prabhupada gives the example that when Prabhupada came to the United States for the first time, he said, I did not know how to go from New York to Pennsylvania, Butler, although there was a person who was trying to help, but still Prabhupada was not sure where to go, where to carry the things, how things function here. And therefore Prabhupada says I was a little disturbed. But when one is in knowledge, one is not disturbed. And knowledge means to be able to understand both the constantly changing physical manifestation and eternally existing spiritual manifestation. So unless there is no knowledge or understanding of this both natures, the physical phenomenal manifestation and the spiritual manifestation, one cannot remain dhira or sober or unagitated. As long as people are just aware of only one branch of knowledge, therefore, because in this world there is so much dearth of lack of spiritual knowledge, people are constantly agitated and struggling. So as soon as the spiritual knowledge, this transcendental knowledge, the transcendental message is spoken, heard, discussed, as soon as that is done, there is a change in one's consciousness, in one's mind being attached to that sat, or the eternal aspects of truth. Then immediately that removes agitation from one's heart. In other place, Prabhupada writes in another purport of Bhagavatam that how chanting Hare Krishna Maha Mantra cleanses our heart. One of the effects of cleansing the heart means we are not affected by the external changes that are taking place. There are so many things that are going around us, sometimes positive, negative, various kinds. As we know, there are sometimes some people are troubling us, some people are not respecting us, people are not listening to us in different ways. And then immediately we become very turbulent, agitated, and angry, and so on and so forth. But external turbulences should not disturb a living entity. And by chanting, Prabhupada says offenselessly, one's heart becomes purified, and in the purified state of heart, one is not disturbed by the external circumstances. That does not mean that one is not taking action. This does not mean that one is not um, remaining inactive. It only means that in an unagitated way, one is still functioning and doing his duties. So that is a very important principle. And the second example, and very important example that Prabhupada gives of the physical nature is the material body. So, and Prabhupada is explaining here is how this material body is endlessly mutable, it's constantly changing. All the cells in our body are changing constantly, and once in few years, they're all replaced by new cells. And from what we were a few years before, what we will be if we exist in the future in this body, we are always changing. And in the Vedic literatures, the body is said to undergo 6 different changes. The first is the birth. Every living entity in the material world has a body, and the body has a start point, birth. And then it grows, and then it remains in that form for some time. And so basically, growth means different kinds of transformations. So our body is growing in different ways, and therefore our organs are growing in different ways. And then they remain for some duration of time. There are some byproducts, and then they dwindle, and finally they vanish. So all living entities undergo this 6 bodily transformation in the material world. So the material body is one that is undergoing all this transformation, while the soul is actually aloof from all these changes. But when it is unaware, when it is in lack of knowledge, it associates itself with these 6 changes and therefore constantly fears. It's constantly agitated by these different changes that are taking place. But actually, the spirit soul is not undergoing any of these changes. And because of this constant change or mutation, endlessly mutable physical nature, it is known as Adibhutam. Now, because it is constantly mutable, it has a period of start and period of end. So that is the nature of all this physical manifestation. And then there is description about Adidevata, where Prabhupada says the all the demigods like the sun and moon, and in the translation Prabhupada says the universe is the cosmic form of Supreme Lord. So all the material manifestation, the different planetary systems, the demigods, the living entities, so they are also expansion of the Lord. So this is another very important aspect that needs to be understood, is that what is the connection between the physical manifestation, the universe that we see, and the Supreme Lord? Is there some connection or is there no connection? So usually, the materialist, the scientist, they study the material existence or physical nature independent of the Supreme Lord. They do not see the relationship. They think that this mutation is the important aspect of study. But they do not pay attention. What is the factor that is causing this mutation? Why is this mutation happening? Where does this mutation began from? Those are more fundamental and difficult questions, and therefore scientists and many philosophers they ignore that or not pay enough attention to understand those most important questions, and they get lost in studying one form of mutation or another form of mutation, and thinking that one theory or another theory is better to live their life. But as we see here, Prabhupada and also in Bhagavad Gita, Lord also explains many different places as what is the relationship between this physical manifestation and himself. So it is very important to see that we, as we'll also see in the later chapters, there is a 9th chapter where the Lord explains how this material manifestation is nothing but its impersonal manifestation. It actually is an expansion of his energy. So in Srimad Bhagavatam, Prabhupada also gives the example that actually nothing is independent. There is no independent existence to anything without the uh, the presence of the Supreme Lord, without the cause of the Supreme Lord. Or in other words, everything is dependent on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And Prabhupada in one case gives an example of an electric bulb. The Prabhupada says, just like if you look at the electric bulb, it is glowing, it is functioning. Now, is it really independent? Not really. Prabhupada says, just like if you pay close attention, you will see that this electric bulb is glowing because of the powerhouse which is supplying electricity to this place to light the lamp or the bulb. Now, where is that powerhouse getting that ability to generate electricity? Because of the water, some other form of energy that is being used to produce electricity. Now, where is that water coming from? The clouds. And where is that clouds coming from? From the sun. And where is that sun coming from? So if we go endlessly in this way, search for the real cause, we will see that the sun, which is a part of creation, and creation, which is part of the Supreme Lord, and therefore the Lord is the cause of all causes, and therefore without the Lord, there is no independent existence for anything, and there's no independent functioning of anything. So in that sense, everything is actually dependent on the Lord, fundamentally. And also, it is also said that Parasya Sakti Vividaiva Shvete, although the Lord is one, his energies are multifold. His potencies are many diverse. And those diverse potencies act in different ways. And one form of that energy is the material manifestation. The Mahatattva, the Mahavishnu, from whom this cosmic manifestation comes about. Now, he creates this material cosmic manifestation. And it is important to note that without the Lord, this manifestation has no independent existence. But when we are limited with our limited senses, we cannot really understand these ultimate truths. With Prabhupada gives another example of someone using a binoculars or some sort of telescope to see some stars or something. You can hardly see a very minute portion of this creation of this universe itself. And what to speak of the entire creation, the entire universe, and all the cosmic universes that are present within this material world. It's impossible for us because we are limited. And therefore, it is so important that only by hearing from the teachings of a pure devotee of the Lord and the teachings of the Supreme Lord, that we can understand these fundamental nature of the ultimate truths. Therefore, for people who are less intelligent, the universal form of the Lord is the first step in God realization. Just like we see in the first canto, third chapter, and also in the second canto, early chapters, there is description about the Virat form of the Lord. And that form where the different, as we see in the last sentences, Prabhupada explains that how the neophyte is advised to contemplate the universal form, whose legs are considered the lowest planets, whose eyes are considered the sun and moon, and whose head is considered the upper planetary system. So in this way, the cosmic manifestation is compared to the universal form of the Lord, with different elements of this material manifestation to be different bodily parts of the Lord. And in this way, the living entity develops the first conception that there is some form of supreme person or supreme energy or some form of greater authority beyond one's own self. And Prabhupada gives example that this is because when one is less intelligent, Prabhupada also goes on to give examples of aborigines, the people who are tribals or who are in the primitive stage in the understanding of the highest things. So for them, if they see a tiger, they see, oh, tiger has such wonderful ability to run, to do some things wonderful. Or they see a huge mountain and they are in awe and they respect. Oh, there's a greater energy, there's greater force, there's something higher than me. And they start to go down. So their understanding of God is something higher than them, or something that is doing something much better than what they are able to do it. And in this form, most tribals worship the different elements of the nature. And slightly higher than that is to see this cosmic manifestation. Oh, there is beautiful sun, so many stars, so many trees, so many mountains. So in a higher sense, by seeing these things, one start to appreciate the presence of a supreme energy or superior energy. And it is in this way that the neophytes can actually elevate themselves in first steps of God realization. And that's why it is very important that there are different kinds of devotees, and there is the Kanishta Adhikari, the Madhyama Adhikari, the Uttama Adhikari, the Mahabhagavata. So the Mahabhagavata, or the highly elevated, highest class of devotees, they are always able to see the Lord. So while the neophytes, they can only appreciate the universal form of the Lord in some sense, but they cannot actually understand the transcendental form of the Lord. Whereas a Mahabhagavata devotee, although he is seeing everything, both the moving and the non-moving, Stavara Jangama Dekhe, Na Dekhe Taramurti. So Stavara Jangama Dekhe. So he is seeing both the moving and the non-moving things. But he is not seeing the forms just as they are. But what is he saying? He's saying Sarvatra Jangama, Stavara Jangama Dekhe, Na Dekhe Taramurti, Sarvatra Spurti. So Ishtadeva. So he's actually seeing the form of the Lord. So he's not actually, so whenever he's seeing actually the Lord. He is not enamored or he is not captivated with just the external form of something, but he's actually able to see the Lord. And that's why taking shelter of a Mahabhagavata devotee is the way for us to actually understand these higher truths about the Lord and his relationship in this material world and so on and so forth. Otherwise, one has to endlessly go on speculating as what is the relationship of the Lord to this material manifestation and so on and so forth. So that is the second aspect of discussion in this verse. And the third aspect is Adiyatna, the super soul. And Krishna is saying here, Aham Eva, certainly I am that super soul who is within this body, who is dwelling in the heart of every embodied being. So this is another important principle, that who is super soul and who is the living entity. Most often, people misunderstand that the living entity and the super soul are the same. And as soon as the living entity becomes liberated, it actually becomes super soul, or it merges into the super soul, and so on and so forth. But actually, there is a distinction between the super soul and the living entity. And that is always explained wonderfully by the Vaishnava Acharyas, Srila Prabhupada. And it is also important to understand what is the relationship of super soul to the Supreme Lord, the personal form of the Lord, Sri Krishna. So Prabhupada is writing here, the super soul is the plenary representation of Lord Krishna. So as we just mentioned, the Lord expands himself in multiple folds, in multiple ways. And one is that his own plenary expansion. Other is the so many living entities and the material energy. These are all different forms of expansions of these energies or his own self. So now the super soul is also actually is dependent upon the Supreme Lord. Is the Supreme Lord Shri Krishna of his different expansions. One of them is the super soul. And as we know in Srimad Bhagavatam, different expansions of the Lord are described wonderfully well as how from Mahavishnu, the Garbhodakshaya Vishnu, Kshirodakshaya Vishnu, and how they enter each of the universe and then each of the living entities' heart, and so on and so forth. So it is very important that the source of all of them is actually the Supreme Lord, Shri Krishna. So actually nothing is independent. Everything is dependent upon the Supreme Lord. And Prabhupada is emphasizing here the word Eva is particularly important in the context of this verse, because by this word, the Lord stresses that the Paramatma is not different from him. So the Lord and his plenary expansions are not to be seen to be different. They're all above the modes of material nature. And therefore, it is very important that we recognize there is presence of the Lord, uh, Super Soul, who is beyond the living entity, who is also present in our heart. And as we see in the first steps of God realization, one is to understand the Lord in the form of the universal cosmic form. Then there's people who understand him in the form of Brahman. And then there are people who understand him to be the absolute truth, to be Paramatma. And it is also to be known that the supreme absolute truth in its completeness is actually the Bhagavan, or the personal form of the Lord. And here it is said that the super soul, the supreme personality of Godhead, seated beside the individual soul, is a witness of the individual soul's activities and is a source of consciousness. Now, this is a very interesting point. The other day, Bhaktivinoda was also asking that if the Lord or Paramatma is the source of the consciousness, then one may question, why is that the living entities are having different consciousness? Why is not that all living entities have the same consciousness? If the Lord is giving consciousness, then all consciousness must be same. Why there should be any difference? Or so Prabhupada explains this somewhere else by stating that the living entity, although the nature of Prabhupada gives an analogy actually. Prabhupada says that although the nature of fire is one, based upon the kind of the wood, the shape of the wood, the flame may be different. So similarly, based upon the desire of the living entity, the individual soul, the Lord gives different types of consciousness. If the living entity wants to enjoy in a certain way, then the Lord manifests, provides a certain kind of material body for that living entity, by which the living entity develops a certain kind of consciousness. So it is as in another place, Prabhupada explains that there is always there is some living entity is never independent, and it is always interdependent, or it is always dependent on the super soul. It cannot function independently. And in order to explain this point, Prabhupada gives some very wonderful examples. And Prabhupada states that just like Prabhupada says, you see, there is sun and the sunshine, and the sunshine has no meaning if the living entity has no eyes. And the eyes have no meaning if there is no sunshine. So the world is arranged in such a beautiful way that there is sunshine and there is the eyes. Now, both when these two things come together, there is an interdependence, and through that, one is able to see. Similarly, there is this material manifestation, and there is the spiritual being, the spirit soul, and the Lord is giving the ability to perceive things. The Lord is Paramatma, is enabling the living entity to be able to perceive the world. And therefore, this interdependence of the living entity on the super soul is to be always understood. That the living entity is not the independent doer. The living entity is always dependent on the mercy of the Lord. So when one's heart is cleansed, the another aspect of chanting Hare Krishna and cleansing the heart is that one is able to see the relationship of the Lord's presence in all things and all activities. One does not see things to be independent. One does not see oneself to be an independent doer. One always sees the mercy of the Lord. This is another principle. And as soon as one sees the presence of the Lord, the mercy of the Lord, one is not agitated. One knows I have to take shelter of the Lord. And I should do best of my abilities and then depend upon the Lord. So, in other words, that if we do not recognize the presence of the super soul, there is a possibility that the living entity thinks that it's my own moving that the things are moving in this world. Because of my ability, everything is happening. There is nothing superior or beyond me that is actually the cause. And in this way, the living entity gets trapped and becomes agitated and worried about success and failure. So it is important that This process of devotional service enables one to develop that relationship with Paramatma. And it is by that that we receive the further guidance, because when the living entity's consciousness is covered, he is unable to hear the voice of Paramatma. But by rendering devotional service under the guidance of a bona fide spiritual master, one can actually hear the voice of Paramatma more and more clearly, and thereby make one's life free from all anxieties. And it is also here said that the functions of all these different manifestations of the Supreme Lord automatically become clarified to the pure Krishna conscious devotee engaged in transcendental service of the Lord. So it is, as I was just explaining, the process of cleansing the heart is also being talked about here. In other words, that how one can understand all these aspects of what is super soul, what is the living entity, what is its physical manifestation. They're so complex. There's so many causes, so many different interrelationships. It is very, very difficult, impossible for anyone to actually make sense by one's own intelligence. It is not possible to decipher these transcendental subject matters by mundane scholarship or speculation. It can be only become clarified, or one can understand, by engaging in transcendental service of the Lord. And how do we understand the transcendental service of the Lord? Only when we come in contact with the Mahabhagavata devotee. The Mahabhagavata devotee is in pure Krishna consciousness. He is actually seeing the Lord in all spaces, in all times, everywhere. And he is always engaged in the service of the Lord. And therefore, it is by rendering service to an Uttamadhikari, by pleasing Mahabhagavata devotee, that we get the mercy and strength to engage in transcendental service of the Lord. And this is very great science, that simply by understanding, by engaging in this transcendental service of the Lord, freedom from all sufferings, all misconceptions, the darkness of ignorance vanquishes. Otherwise, everyone is caught up in different levels of ignorance, of different categories of ignorance. But only the Mahabhagavata is in pure knowledge, and he's acting according to the pure knowledge. And only by rendering service unto him that we actually learn how to engage in transcendental service of the Lord. And it is by that we receive the favor of the Lord, Tadami Buddhi Yogam Tam, who vanquishes all misgivings in our heart, all ignorance in our heart, and gives us intelligence as how to come back to him. How do we change our desire? Our desires, which are the material state of consciousness, are filled with so many material conceptions and material desires. But by constant engagement in transcendental service of the Lord, we will overcome all the material desires and dovetail or transform them into spiritual desires and service of the Lord. And it is by these engagements that we can understand all these truths very easily and make further progress in devotional life, be free from all kinds of mysteries. I'll stop and see if there are any questions or comments. No questions, comments, we'll stop here. Bhagavad Gita ki jai.